My talk today is going to be based on exploring rendering modes in Nuxt 3, from SSR to SPA and everything in between. But before that, allow me to introduce myself. So who am I? My name is Salamon Brahanu. I'm a front-end developer working with both the Nuxt and the Vue 3. I'm also an open source contributor. I like contributing to open source. And these are my social handles on GitHub. You can find me by typing at Salomon Dev, and on Twitter, the same. And on all my social media handles, this is the image that I use. So the sessions, we decided to actually break it down into different parts. So the first part, in the first session, we introduced Nuxt 3. We talked about what Nuxt 3 is. We talked about the differences between Nuxt 3 and Nuxt 2. We also dived a little bit deep into bundlers, the bundlers that Nuxt 3 uses and Nuxt 2 uses. And for today's session, we are going to be talking about rendering modes. And the other coming sessions, we are going to be talking about the features, tools used to build Nuxt 3, and then lastly, we are going to be looking at deployments. But for today, allow me to introduce rendering modes in Nuxt 3. But before we start talking about our rendering modes, we must first understand what is rendering in the first place. Rendering, rendering is simply the process of converting a web page application's code into a visual representation or a beautiful UI that can be displayed in the browser. So we as the developers write code. And so rendering, what it simply does is it takes your web application's code and change it or convert it into a beautiful UI or a beautiful visual representation that the end user can see. So in rendering, we also have some concepts such as passing of code, execution of JavaScript, and also applying of CSS styles. Allow me to explain each and every one of them. So we can start with passing code. So what this simply means, it's simply the process of breaking down the code into small pieces that the browser can understand and identify the different HTML elements that are available on the page, such as the header, the body, the footer, and other semantic HTML tags that are available. And then the second process is actually the execution of JavaScript, whereby JavaScript is actually executed or run so as to add function, so add interactivity and make your web page feel alive. So a good example is, let's say, for example, you have a hamburger menu on your site. So you go ahead and when you click it, you actually see a sidebar transitioning from the left or right, depending on where you kept it. And so that interactivity is enabled by JavaScript. And then lastly, we have applying of CSS styles, whereby the CSS code will be used to control the appearance of the page, such as the layout, the colors, the fonts, the padding, and the margin. And so sometimes in rendering, this order might not be as is. Sometimes it changes depending on various factors. For example, sometimes it might be passing of code, execution of JavaScript, and lastly, applying of CSS styles. And other times, you might find that the order changes and execution of JavaScript actually is at the top, and then passing of code follows. And then lastly, we have applying of CSS styles. So this order actually changes depending on various factors. So let me just give you one example. Assuming you have a huge JavaScript bundle size, what the browser might decide to do is first to execute the JavaScript so as to enable the passing of code efficiently, and then lastly, applying of the CSS styles. So it depends on various factors. So after understanding what rendering is and the concepts in rendering, you might be wondering, where can rendering be done? Well, rendering can be done in two places. The first place being the client, aka the browser, and the second place where rendering can be done is on the server. So as with everything, there must be something that powers something in order for it to do something. So in terms of rendering, what enables all this process to occur are things known as engines. So depending on your favorite web browser, there are actually engines that power this process. So the first rendering engine is known as Chromium, which is used by Chrome, by Brave, and by Opera. And the other rendering engine is known as Gecko, which is a rendering engine for Firefox. And lastly, we have WebKit, which is a rendering engine for Safari and also other browsers. So these three rendering engines are actually not limited to the browsers I've just mentioned. Some of them actually interchange. Let's say, for example, Chrome uses other engines, but it mostly uses Chromium as its default engine, and it's also created by the engineers at Chrome. And we also have Opera, which also uses Chromium, and also Brave, which uses Chromium. And you might be tempted to think that, oh, since Chrome uses Chromium, that means that I can get the same benefits that Chrome has in Opera, but you'll be wrong because it uses that engine, but Opera has added features on top of that engine that Chrome provides you with. That's the Chromium engine. So each of them are actually different. So now let's look at the rendering modes that Nuxt provides us with. So the first rendering mode is known as client-side rendering. The second one is known as server-side rendering. The third one is known as static site generation, or in other terms, people like calling it SSG. We have incremental static regeneration, ISR. We have universal rendering, which combines the best worlds of server-side rendering and client-side rendering. We also have hybrid rendering and edge rendering, but edge rendering is not a rendering mode. And I'll explain this later. I just wanted to bring it in your reader. So let's start with client-side rendering. So what is client-side rendering? Well, client-side rendering is a rendering mode whereby your entire application is rendered on the client, aka the browser. So this is the rendering mode that you use in a typical Vue application without Nuxt. It works using client-side rendering, and we often refer to them as single-page applications simply because, number one, the HTML file, or rather a HTML file with only a reference to your JavaScript bundle is served for all routes. And secondly, all navigation is done on the client side. That's why we call it single-page applications. Now, in Nuxt 3, you can actually use client-side rendering. But before we go there, let's first understand how client-side rendering works. So first, a request is sent to the web server by the client. The web server receives the request and responds by sending back an empty HTML page with only a reference to your JavaScript bundle and CSS styles. The browser then starts downloading the JavaScript of the page. The browser then executes the JavaScript. And lastly, for the first time, the page is now viewable and interactive. But as all this was occurring till the fourth step, the end user or the customer, if you like, has not seen anything. So as all this is happening behind the scenes, the user is just there waiting for the site to load, and they actually have not seen anything. And when the browser has been downloaded and executed, now that's the first time the page is now viewable and interactive, and the user can now be able to see and interact with the application. So this is how it occurs. So first, we can see this loader because it's loading. The browser downloads an empty HTML document with only a reference to your JavaScript bundle. The browser then downloads and runs the JavaScript. Then after that, in the fifth step, the app is now viewable and interactive. So in just a moment, I'm going to show you how this occurs. I'm going to show you everything that I've just talked about. We are going to move from the theoretical part to the practical part, and you'll understand everything much deeper. So let's look at the advantages of client-side rendering. So the first one is fast rendering. What do I mean by fast rendering? So by fast rendering, I simply mean after the initial page load, that is after our application has fast rendered, any subsequent navigation after that is really, really fast. So let's say, for example, we can now see our client-side rendered application. So I decide to navigate from one route to the other. What happens is that this happens really, really quickly, simply because, number one, we don't need to download any JavaScript code. When we simply navigate from one route to the other, only the HTML files are generated, which results in fast rendering. The second is reduced server load, because everything is handled by the browser and we don't actually put any load on the server. So everything happens in the browser. Third, it's cheap, simply because we are not using any servers, we are not renting servers, we are not maintaining servers. Everything happens in our browsers, and it's really, really cheap to host our client-side rendered application. The fourth one is it results in a good user experience. But let me explain how this is actually achieved in client-side rendered applications. So in client-side rendered applications, they are actually fast rendering. That's after the first initial page load. When you navigate from one page to the other, it's really, really fast. So by it being fast, the user enjoys being on your site. That is after the initial page load time. And this results in a good user experience. And also, you can be able to add transitions in different sections of your web applications, or when a user navigates from one route to the other, you can simply add transitions. And also, it's simply because the fact that when you build your application in a client-side rendered manner, there is the interactivity is so good that the user will actually enjoy being on your application, because it's really, really good in terms of interactivity. And also, the fifth advantage of client-side rendered application is that it works well with PWAs. So PWA stands for Progressive Web Applications. And what progressive web applications are? These are simply web applications that are designed to work offline and be installed on a user's device. So in terms of why client-side rendered applications work well with progressive web apps, it's simply because the code can entirely be rendered on the browser. And in terms of the offline functionality, in client-side rendered applications, they have caching mechanisms. Other people call it cache, other people call it cache, I call it cache. It's C-A-C-H-E, I call it cache. So in client-side rendered applications, you can actually configure caching. And what cache simply is, it's simply a temporary or a storage mechanisms whereby frequent requested data are stored so that future requests for that data can be loaded really quickly. So in terms of progressive web apps, client-side rendered applications cache essential resources or required resources in the user's device, enabling progressive web applications to function even when there is no network connection. So by leveraging the power of client-side rendering, whereby we have caching strategies, PWAs can actually work very well by actually storing the essential resources. And then later, when there is no network connection, the PWA actually continues working really well, but you won't get any new data. You'll only have the data that was stored in the cache. So let's look at the disadvantages of client-side rendering. So the first one being is really, really bad for SEO, simply because when the crawlers come to your site, they come and then when they see your page, there's no content. It just contains some links, some script tags, and we only have a reference to your JavaScript bundle, which is the entry point of your application. And when they see this, they just conclude that, okay, this site has no content. And so they just leave. But in reality, all your content is actually in that JavaScript bundle. But as web crawlers were created, they were never created to go inside your JavaScript bundle and then look for the content. They were never created that way. The way they were created by Google is actually to go to the site that has content by default, index that page, and then if this is the page that the user was looking for, serve that page or rank that page at the top or in the second position or the third position. But when you look at client-side rendered applications, there is no content. What there simply is in the HTML page is simply a reference to the JavaScript bundle. And so this is very bad for in terms of SEO. Slow initial page load. So what this simply means is that as all the process are occurring, the process of client-side rendering, how a request is sent to the server, and then the server are responding back by sending back an empty HTML page with only a reference to your JavaScript bundle. When all these processes are occurring, the user is actually not seeing anything. The user is just there waiting. And so in terms of the initial page load, it's really, really slow. And if you have a huge JavaScript bundle size, you'll actually see the effect of this because you'll have to wait until the browser downloads all the JavaScript and then executes it, then renders the web application. So you'll have to wait. And this leads to a slow initial page load because it's really, really slow. Bad user experience, simply because number one, you have to wait until the JavaScript has been downloaded, parsed, and executed. So that leads to a bad user experience because the user might be there wondering, why is this site not loading? Is there a problem? And what they normally do is, if it takes long, they leave. I mean, you have also done that at some point, whereby you have visited a website and then it just takes too long to load. What do? You just leave and go maybe to another site. So it's really, really bad in terms of user experience. So let's see this in action. So let me take you over to my Visual Studio Code. Okay. Okay, so let me take you inside my code. So this is simply a movie application created with Nuxt 3. I cloned it from GitHub. It was created by the Nuxt core team members, such as Daniel Rowe, Pio, and also Anthony Fu. they created this simple Nuxt 3 movie application using the TMDB API to actually showcase the power of Nuxt 3. So if I just start the application, so that has started. So if I just head over to localhost 3000, so as that is starting, let's look at the use cases of client-side rendering. When should you be using client-side rendering? So the first use case is if you have a site that doesn't require SEO, sites that you don't won't even like people to know about, and examples of sites that don't require search engine optimizations include admin dashboards. If you have a dashboard, of course, you wouldn't like anyone to know, or SEO is not required in such a particular scenario because that dashboard belongs only to you and the other members who have access to it. And if you have highly interactive pages, so if you have pages that are highly interactive, such as gaming applications, they are really, really highly interactive. This is whereby client-side rendering is a good option to opt in. And admin dashboards. Web applications that need to work offline, PWEs, we have talked about that. If you need to create an application that needs to work offline, client-side rendering is really, really a good choice to go with. So, as with always, we must see how we enable client-side rendering in Nuxt 3. How do we do that? So we need to go to our Nuxt config.ts file, which I like to call it settings. I like calling it settings because that's where everything happens. That's where you can define how your Nuxt 3 application should behave. So in our case, we need to go to our nuxt.config.ts file and then set the SSR property to false. So by us doing this, we are telling Nuxt, hey Nuxt, this is now a client-side rendered application. And okay. I actually realized that I was not sharing this screen. So let's actually go back. Sorry for that. And so we actually started from here. The use cases of client-side rendering. You will use them in sites that don't require SEO, highly interactive pages. As client-side rendering is a really good option for this. If you have admin dashboards, really, really good choice because you don't need SEO for this. And web applications that need to work offline. An example, progressive web apps, which we have just talked about. And so how do we enable client-side rendering in Nuxt 3? We simply go to our nuxt.config.ts file, which I like calling settings, and then set the SSR property to false. And by doing this, we are simply telling Nuxt, hey Nuxt, now this application of mine is client-side rendered. And so that's what the SSR property does. By setting it to false, we are telling Nuxt, now this is a client-side rendered application. So if I simply go back to my Nuxt app, it's still loading. Okay, let me just stop it. And then I'll run it from here. So if I head over to localhost 3001, okay, it's taking some time to start. I don't know why. So we'll actually continue. We shall move on as that is happening. And so how do we build a client-side rendered application in Nuxt 3? So we run the Nuxt generate command, which will go ahead and build our client-side rendered application. And then we will have a .output directory, which will be created, which will contain a public directory, which inside that it will contain the entry point of our Nuxt application, which is kind of a similar way when you create a view application using the view CLI. Whenever you bundle it, you actually see only, you have the dist folder, and inside that dist folder, you find that there is a file that has been generated for you. And if you go inside that file, if you look at what has been generated, it's a simple HTML page with nothing, but with only a reference to a JavaScript bundle, which is actually the entry point of your application. So next, we'll go ahead and look at server-side rendering as our Nuxt application is loading because it hasn't still started. So actually, let me go ahead and just terminate it and then start it over again. Just give me a moment. So we'll actually let that start in the background. And let's move on to the second rendering mode, which is server-side rendering. So what is server-side rendering in the first place? So server-side rendering is a technique whereby it's a rendering mode technique whereby the entire application is rendered on the server. And in SSR or in server-side rendering, the HTML is generated on each request. So whenever you do anything in a server-side rendered application, the HTML is actually generated on each request. So when you navigate from one page to another, the request is sent to the server, and the server responds back by sending a HTML page which is fully populated with the data and which is served to the user so that the user can be able to see it. And so that's why we say the HTML is generated on each request. So how does server-side rendering work in the first place? A request is sent to the web server by the client. The server then responds by sending back a fully populated HTML page with content, but the page is not yet interactive. So here the keyword is the server responds by sending back a fully populated HTML page with content, but the page is not yet interactive. The page is only viewable, but not interactive. And then the browser then downloads the JavaScript of the page, which is readily available on the server. And then the HTML is now made interactive through a process known as hydration. So I'm sure you've heard of the term hydration a lot of times. And so what hydration simply means, it's just the process of using client-side JavaScript to add interactivity and state to server rendered HTML. So we have actually seen that the server responds by sending back a fully populated HTML page with content, but the page is not yet interactive. The page is only viewable. The user can actually see the page, but it's not yet interactive. And then after that, the browser downloads the JavaScript of the page, which is readily available on the server. And then the HTML page is made interactive through a process known as hydration. And then after that, the page is now fully loaded and interactive. And now the user can be able to interact with the application the way he or she wants. And so in server-side rendering, this is how the process occurs. The full HTML is sent to the browser and rendered. We can actually see here it is. There is no loading or anything. This actually happens really, really quickly. And then the browser downloads and runs the JavaScript in the background as the user is actually viewing the application. In the background, the browser is downloading and running the JavaScript in the background. And then after that, hydration occurs. So when hydration steps in, it makes the HTML that was sent now fully interactive. And now anything in your application that was using JavaScript can now be used without any problem. Let's say you had a button that increments the count of a count. Let's say you had a button and then the count was 0. So if you now press the button, what happens is that you can see the count incrementing because JavaScript is available. But before hydration occurs, if you try pressing the button, nothing actually occurs. And I'm actually waiting for Nuxt to start. I actually don't know what's wrong, but after it has started, I'll show you everything, how everything occurs and what I'm talking about. So we'll move from the theoretical part and then we'll actually see it in action. So what are the advantages of server-side rendering? So the first one, of course, good for SEO. So if you're someone who would like people to find your application, let's say you are selling products, and of course, if you're selling products, the first thing you want is for the products to sell, and for the products to sell, users or customers must find your application. And for this to happen, your application should be SEO optimized. It should be really, really optimized in terms of SEO. So how does server-side rendering help in this? Well, we have actually seen that the server responds back by sending HTML page that is fully populated with data. And so when it does this, when the web crawlers land on your site, they can actually see, aha, there's content. So let me index this and actually see if the user, when the user has searched for a term such as, let's say, Nike shoes, if whatever the user has searched is actually in here and it has been well written and described, I will actually serve this to the user, and that will enable you to rank at the top, and you'll be able to get a lot of traffic simply because your HTML page has data, unlike in client-side rendering, whereby an empty HTML page is actually sent with only a reference to the JavaScript bundle. But in server-side rendering, the HTML page is fully populated with your data. And amazing user experience, simply because the initial page load time is really, really quick. Because when the request is sent to the server quickly responds by sending a HTML page that is fully populated with the data, and then the user can actually see, aha, so okay, this is the products that are available. But what the user actually doesn't know is that JavaScript is running in the background. But what the user cares to see is that there is something viewable. I can actually see that this is available, that's available. And that leads to an amazing user experience because the app feels fast. And no slow internet connection barrier. What do I mean by this? As we know, when we have a huge JavaScript bundle size, the browser actually downloads the JavaScript fast. But in terms of server-side rendering, even if the user has a slow internet connection, that is not a problem because the JavaScript is being downloaded in the browser behind the scenes. So even if it's taking long to download, the user can actually see the application. The user can actually see the products that are available. So they won't need to wait. Now imagine this in a client-side rendered application whereby there's a slow internet connection and then the user just has to wait. That will take a really, really long. But in server-side rendering applications, this is where it really shines because the user doesn't need to worry because the user can simply see the products that are available on your web applications. And performance benefit for users and customers because users can be able to get what they're looking for, and in return, you get a high traffic to your website or web application. You actually make some sales, and both you and the user benefit from server-side rendering. So as with everything that is good, there is also something bad. So let's look at the disadvantages of server-side rendering. So the first one is server costs. Since the entire application is rendered on the server, that means that you will need to rent a server and also maintain the server, which in turn, that means you'll have to spend some money on that. And so there are some server costs. And actually, whichever deployment target that you choose to deploy your server-side rendered application on, let's say if you chose Vercel or Netlify, you'll actually be charged in terms of you having the server and also the requests. Increased server load. If there is a huge traffic to your website, and of course, a huge traffic means that a lot of requests will be sent, and this might actually increase the load on the server, and this might cause it sometimes not to perform really well. And what does this mean? If there is increased server load, you must also get in another server and distribute the load. Increased hosting costs, of course. This is just the same as server costs, whereby in order to host your server-side rendered application, you will incur costs. You'll be needed to pay for the servers and also in terms of maintaining the server. incompatible with some UI libraries and packages. Well, this is true. I don't know if you have ever experienced an error known as hydration mismatch. So this error normally happens. It's simply because some UI libraries or packages, some of them utilize the window or document object whereby they need to utilize it. And so if you have used a toaster component, for example, like ViewSonar, what happens is that it utilizes the window API to actually display the toast on various parts of the window. And so in server-side rendering application, we don't have that. We don't have the window or document object. And so this leads to some incompatibility with some UI libraries and packages, but there's a way to solve this. There's a way to solve this. So in Nuxt, you are actually given the client-only component, which helps tell Nuxt, hey Nuxt, see, this component should only be rendered on the client and not on the server. So if you have any package or plugin or a component in a UI library that is not compatible with server-side rendering, what you can simply do is just simply use the client-only component that Nuxt provides you with. Or if you are registering a plugin that should only be used on the client, you can actually use the .client prefix whenever you're using it. And also after doing that, make sure you have also wrapped it inside the client-only component so that you won't get any hydration mismatch errors. So when should you use server-side rendering? So number one, when you want good SEO performance. So if you want your products to be or to sell your products, you should be using server-side rendering simply because whenever anyone comes on Google and searches, let's say for Nike shoes, if you are selling Nike shoes and you're using server-side rendering, and not just server-side rendering, you also need to optimize your web application in terms of SEO. How well have you structured your content? How well have you used semantic HTML tags? How well have you written your descriptions and all that? How well have you utilized the tools that Nuxt actually has given you? We have helpers and composables in Nuxt 3, use SEO Meta. We also have some packages that are provided by Nuxt 3 and also modules to help you in terms of SEO. So you need actually to have all this in order to enjoy the benefits of getting huge traffic. And so if you use server-side rendering, by default, you'll get all these benefits. But if we go back to client-side rendering, even if you use all the tools that Nuxt 3 have given you, your application won't rank at the top. So you need server-side rendering plus the you optimizing your application, writing good descriptions and using semantic HTML tags really, really well to enjoy the full benefits. So if you have information-driven sites such as blogs, or if you, of course, e-commerce sites, news applications or marketing sites, these are all information-driven sites. So if you have such applications or sites, it's good to be using server-side rendering. When you have dynamic content, of course, if you have any content that changes frequently, it's advised to use server-side rendering because the HTML is generated on each request. So if a user is searching for something or wants something, every time they're navigating to that particular location, the request or the data that is gotten back from the server is actually, if it has changed, is actually the new data that is up to date. So when you have dynamic content, server-side rendering is a really, really good option to go with. So how do we enable server-side rendering in Nuxt 3? So once again, we go back to our nuxt.config.ts file. And inside here, we set the SSR property to true. And by doing this, we now tell Nuxt 3, hey Nuxt, now our application is server-side rendered. And when building our server-side rendered application, we build it using the command nuxt build. So now let's go to the next rendering mode, which is static site generation. Now, as we have seen in server-side rendering, there are some disadvantages, right, that we faced, including server costs and also hosting. When we host our server-side rendering app, we actually need, we incur costs. And so in static site generation, there are some things that actually change. Let's look at it. But before that, what is static site generation? Well, static site generation is a rendering mode or a tool that generates a fully static HTML web application based on raw data and a set of templates. And when does this happen? So in static site generation, the HTML is generated at build time. In server-side rendering, the HTML is generated on each request. But in static site generation, the HTML is generated at build time. So there are differences between them. SSR on each request. In SSG, it's at build time. So how does static site generation work? So the front-end code is written and compiled. The SSG then runs a build process at build time to generate the static pages. The static pages are then served to users when they request them. This can simply be done by a web server or by a content delivery network. And actually, there's something known as Jamstack. I don't know whether you have heard of it. So this web development architecture pattern was actually made famous by Netlify, whereby Jamstack or Jam stands for JavaScript, API, and Markdown, whereby the JavaScript is used to add interactivity and the feel alive of your web application. And then we have the API, which is used to retrieve the data from any remote source, such as the database, or if you have a CMS, data is retrieved from there. And then we have Markdown, whereby you'll use that to display the data gotten from your CMS or from your remote source. So, and in Jamstack, it actually follows the similar approach to static site generation, and they're quite the same. And so, actually, I think, have you ever heard of the term grid sum? There was actually a static site generation tool that was created known as grid sum. It was purely used for static site generation, and it was really, really great. I used it twice, and it was really, really amazing. And then I think I stopped receiving updates, and it was really, really great in terms of how fast it was and how you could easily retrieve data from different CMSs. It was really, really great. And in React, we have Gatsby. I'm sure you have heard of that. But in Vue, once upon a time, we had GridSum. And so let's look at the advantages of static site generation. So the first advantage is it's really, really fast. Why? Because the HTML is actually generated at build time. What this simply means is that all your HTML page is built at that time, at build time. And the only thing that will be taken from your Visual Studio Code to GitHub and then to your preferred deployment target is actually those HTML pages that have been generated. And whenever the user requests for that page or for that data, what actually the server does is just to give the user whatever the user has requested for. So there's no need for server-side processing anymore. And so it's really fast. You want this? Here, have it. Really, really fast. The second is amazing user experience, of course, because it's really, really fast. And the third one, it's really cheap to host because we don't have any server processing load the way server-side rendering has. So in terms of static site generation, it's really, really cheap to host and great SEO performance, simply because at build time, the HTML is generated with the data. So whenever you generate the HTML, the data is also included there. So whenever the user requests for something, it's the server gives the user whatever the user has requested for. And by it doing that, it doesn't actually send empty HTML. The data is actually there, which is good for in terms of SEO, because now the crawlers can index the HTML page and see, this is here, this is there. And so this is really great. Let's give this to the user. And so it's really, really great in terms of SEO performance. It's secure since there is no server-side processing. There is no server-side processing that occurs. So it's really, really secure. So hackers can't be able to do anything. So actually, our application has loaded. After a long wait, it has actually loaded. And I don't know why it took so long to load. I don't know whether you can actually see it. Yeah. Can you guys see? Can you see it? Brian, is it viewable on your side?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So it's viewable. And so let's actually go ahead and let me demonstrate, or rather, let me actually just finish talking about it. Then let's finish with the theoretical part, and then we jump into the practical part really quickly. So what are the disadvantages of static site generation? So number one, it's not dynamic. If you have dynamic content, this is really not a good option for you. It's simply because everything is generated at build time. And so whatever was generated at build time is what will be served always until you pull your application down, then update it, and then put it back up. So unless you do that, everything will be static, just as the way it was. So if I wrote some blog articles in 2010 and I use static site generation, what happens is that it will just stay the same as it is. Nothing will ever change. And in terms of build time, it's really, really slow. And this is where by static site generation really, really fails. It's simply because the build time is so long, depending on how many static files you have. So let's say, for example, you have a blog site which has a lot of blog articles. So what will happen is that, let's say if you wanted to update one of your blog articles, or if you wrote a new blog article and you actually wanted it to be displayed on your web application, first what you'll need to do is pull it down, write or pull in your new article, and then build your application again, which will take really long because now it's actually building everything from the start to the finish. And actually, we will see this together. It's really, really, I can say annoying because it really, really takes long. And so the use cases of static site generation, when do we use it? So number one, when you want good SEO performance, simply because at build time, when your HTML files are being generated, also your data is there with it. So in each HTML page, there is data in it. So respective HTML pages and their data are there at build time. When you have a lot of static content, when you have content that will never change, static site generation is really, really good. For example, portfolios. If you have a portfolio site, static site generation is really, really a good choice to go with. When you want a fast website, since everything happens at build time and the server doesn't need to do anything rather than just serve everything, your website becomes really, really fast because what is there is just what gets served. There is nothing that other that occurs. How do we enable static site generation in Nuxt 3? So we head over to our settings, nuxt.config.ts file, and then we use Nitro, which is the server engine that powers Nuxt 3. And then we create an object. Then inside that object, we write the pre-render property. And what pre-render simply means is generate something ahead of time. And let me give you just a simple example. Let's assume that tomorrow you are expecting visitors at your home. So as a good human being, what you'll simply do is that you'll clean your house first. Second is you'll prepare some snacks so that when the day arrives, when the visitors come and visit you, they find that the house is so clean, and then you can go ahead and serve them the snacks. So that's what like pre-rendering is all about, is generating something ahead of time. So here, what we are simply saying is pre-render, and then we create an object whereby we tell Nuxt that you can be able to crawl everything. So it just crawls our application, and then it generates the static HTML files that are required for our pages. And after that, how do we build our static site generated application? We run the command nuxt generate. And we head over to the next rendering mode, which is universal rendering. And so what is universal rendering? Universal rendering is a rendering mode which is a mixture of both the best worlds of server-side rendering and client-side rendering, which also, if you like, SPA. Universal apps are first rendered on the server and then hydrated on the client. Basically, hydration occurs, and we have actually seen what hydration is. And how does universal rendering work? So all the process that happens in server-side rendering first takes place. So since it's a mixture of both the best worlds of server-side rendering and client-side rendering, and as we have seen in server-side rendering, it's really fast. The initial page load time is really, really fast. So what Nuxt does is when a user sends a request to the server, the rendering mode that is used first is server-side rendering. And then after the page has loaded and made interactive, Nuxt automatically switches to client-side rendering mode to enable you to enjoy the benefits of client-side rendering applications, such as navigation fast rendering, whereby if you navigate from one page to the other or from going from one route to the other, the page won't have to refresh again, or a request won't be sent to the server again for that page. And so what Nuxt does is that it switches to client-side rendering to enable you to enjoy the benefits of client-side rendered applications. So what are the advantages of universal rendering? Well, good for SEO, since at first it utilizes the server-side rendering mode. Amazing user experience because we have a faster initial page load time, no slow internet connection barrier. So it's just the same advantages that we get with server-side rendering. Performance benefit for both the users, the customers, and you as the owner of the application that sells the products. Fast rendering, where this is actually client-side rendering coming in, whereby if you navigate from one page to the other, there's no refreshing that occurs. Everything is just there. And actually, you can be able to add transitions when the user navigates from one page to the other. You can now be able to transition, to add transitions and animations. And this will really make your web application feel alive. And the disadvantages of universal rendering. First, it's complex, there's complex development. And what I mean by this is that you, a developer, will need to work with two environments, mainly the client and the server. So these are two different environments that you need to work with, and you need to familiarize yourself with these two environments because the APIs are not quite the same. So server costs, because at first it is server-side rendering. That means you will need to utilize the server. So when should you use universal rendering? When you want a good SEO performance, of course. When you have dynamic content, when you have content that changes a lot, universal rendering is the best option to go with. When you have information-driven sites such as marketing sites, blog sites, and news sites. So how do we enable universal rendering in Nuxt 3? So this is how actually we enable universal rendering in Nuxt 3. We do nothing. Simply because out of the box, Nuxt 3 uses universal rendering. So when you install a fresh new Nuxt 3 project, out of the box is just uses universal rendering. So in your nuxt.config.ts file, you don't need to write anything. So, but how do we build it? Well, by running the nuxt build command. So, and let's talk about incremental static regeneration. So this was created to actually solve the problem that server-side rendering and static side generation had. So which problems are they? Number one, in server-side rendering, you realize that you will actually pay depending on the requests or where you deploy your server-side rendered application to. If you deploy to Vercel, they have packages in terms of if your application makes this amount of requests, this is how much you pay. If you go to Netlify, the same happens. So in order to solve this problem, ISR was introduced. And in terms of static site generation, what problem ISR solves is that you may have realized that in static site generation, the content is static. There is no dynamic content. And that's the disadvantage of static site generation. And that's where incremental static regeneration comes in. And this is what it does. So what is ISR? So ISR, or incremental static regeneration, is a mix of both the best worlds of SSR and SSG. It combines the best of both worlds. How does it work? A request is sent to the web server by the client. The server then responds by sending back a fully populated HTML page with content, but it also caches the rendered HTML. It caches it, it keeps it. After the first request, all other subsequent requests or every other request that will be made after the first request for the same page within the specified time period will be served from the cache. So what happens is that since we have cached the HTML, what happens that every request that is actually made whatever is in that cage is actually what will be served. There is no need to go to the server again. And so Nuxt has a default time period which actually is used in terms of caching. So in Nuxt is actually 1 minute. So if that 1 minute time period has not been reached, what will happen is that every request that is made will actually get the cached data instead of going to the server for the data. Okay. So after the specified time duration, the server continues to send the cached HTML to the user's browser. However, behind the scenes, the server re-renders the page and saves the updated version in the cache. So what happens is that, let's say you have configured, because you can simply configure after how long do you want a request to be sent to the server. So let's say you set it around 2 minutes. So after 2 minutes, the user will actually get the stale content or the content that was in the cache, but in the background, a request has actually been sent to the server to get the fresh content, and then the fresh content is cached. And now if you request for it again, now the new data will be the one which is sent. So what are the advantages of incremental static regeneration? So number one, it's good for SEO because it uses server-side rendering. It's really, really good because what is sent back is a fully populated HTML page. Amazing user experience because it's blazingly fast. There is no build step. And remember when we talked about the pain that we get in static site generation, the disadvantage that we got is build time, whereby I'll have to take down my application, update the content, build again, then deploy it. When all this happens in static site generation, which is really a huge disadvantage, but in ISR, this is why it comes and steps in and says that you don't need to build this anymore. So there is no build step. And so what happens in terms of dynamic content, you'll just specify and tell Nuxt, hey Nuxt, after every 2 minutes, I want you to go to the server or send a request to the server and get the content, cache it, and then display it to the user. It's really, really fast because it combines both the power of server-side rendered application, which are fast, and also static site generated applications are also fast. So incremental static regeneration will be fast by default. And what are the disadvantages of incremental static regeneration? Well, it's you'll now have to, it's complex development, of course, and then you will incur slight server costs. Not that much, just slightly, simply because now here you are actually utilizing the server, but you are the one controlling after how long a request will be sent. In server-side rendered applications, you don't have control. The user can just come and send requests here and there, and go to different parts of your web application. But in incremental static regeneration, you are the one who specifies and tells Nuxt, hey, after this specified period, send a request. So you actually know how many requests was sent after a certain period of time. So use cases of incremental static regeneration, if you want good SEO performance, of course, when you have dynamic content, such as a blog, your blog application. When you have information-driven sites, blogs, marketing sites, and news applications. And how do we enable incremental static regeneration in Nuxt? Well, you simply go to your nuxt.config.ts file, and then you create the route rules property. And then inside them, you specify the path. So here, what I'm simply saying is that every path after the blog, so anything that comes after the blog, blog/article 1, blog/article 2, will be we'll be using incremental static regeneration, whereby the request will be sent after every 5 seconds. So this is simply stale while revalidate, and this is the period. So if you want 1 minute, so if you don't actually specify the time period, Nuxt will actually, you will use Nuxt default configuration, which is 1 minute. So, but us, we have specified, and it will happen after every 5 seconds, a request will be sent. So how do we build it? By running Nuxt build. So we also have hybrid rendering. Let me just go this over quickly. Hybrid rendering, it's simply a mix of all the best worlds of rendering modes. Client-side rendering, server-side rendering, static side generation, universal rendering, incremental static regeneration. It combines all this into one. It gives you the opportunity. Nuxt actually gives you the opportunity now to use it the way you want, since now you have the knowledge to actually decide on this page will use this rendering mode, this page will use this rendering mode. So how do we enable it in Nuxt 3? So we go to our nuxt.config.ts file, and then we say for our home route, it will use static site generation, whereby it will be built only once, and that will occur at build time. For our products, we'll use stale while revalidate. We'll set it to true. This is actually incremental static regeneration. It's similar to it. And then for our blog path, we'll use incremental static regeneration. We set it to true. So by us doing this, what happens is that we have not specified any time duration. So what will happen is that it will use the default Nuxt time period, which is 1 minute, 60 seconds, right? So it's 60 seconds. And then for our admin, we set the SSR to false, which simply means that for our admin dashboard, we'll actually be using client-side rendering. We won't be utilizing server-side rendering. So how do we build? Okay. So how do we build our hybrid rendered application in Nuxt? Well, by using the command Nuxt build. And about edge-side rendering, basically edge-side rendering, it's not a rendering mode. Let's be clear on that. It's not a rendering mode. Actually, I've seen a lot of people getting confused. They think that edge-side rendering is actually a rendering mode, but what actually it is, it's simply a deployment target. And edge-side rendering is a powerful feature that was introduced in Nuxt 3 that allows the rendering of your Nuxt application closer to your users. So this is how the Nuxt team defines edge-side rendering. And so it's not a rendering mode, as I've said, rather it's a deployment target. And what the idea behind edge-side rendering simply is actually the process of bringing the content closer to you. Rather, back then, what we used to do is, let me just give you an example, whereby we are all in Kenya. So we wanted to access the Tesla website. And so Tesla is located in the United States. And so they make electric cars. They're manufacturers of electric cars. And so let's say we wanted to access their content. What happens is when we search Tesla, what happens is that a request starts from here and then goes all the way to the United States. And it goes to the servers that are located in the United States. And then when that request reaches those servers, the servers then send a response back to us, all the way from the United States to Kenya, until now, whereby we have edge-side rendering, whereby instead of our request having to make all that travel from here to the United States, what will happen is that when we make a request, if they have utilized edge-side rendering, what will happen is that their content will be brought closer to us. So their content with the use of CDNs will actually be brought to servers near us. So we are in Kenya. So there are servers, of course, in Kenya. And so they'll be brought, that content will be brought closer to us. So whenever we make a request now, instead of our request going to the United States, it actually goes to the server located in Nairobi or in Mombasa, and then we are quickly served the content that we wanted, which results in a reduced latency. So I just wanted to bring that on your radar so that when you're asked what is edge-side rendering, you don't think that it's a rendering mode, rather it's a deployment target, and actually it can be used with any rendering mode. So if you have client-side rendering, if you choose client-side rendering, server-side rendering, static site generation, incremental static regeneration, hybrid rendering, whichever rendering mode you choose, you can actually utilize edge-side rendering to increase the performance of your Nuxt 3 application. So, thank you.
Amazing presentation, Salman. Thank you, Salman, for that beautiful presentation. I now welcome questions from the audience. Anyone with a question? Rizwan.
Yes, hi guys.
Hello.
Actually, I'm having a question on the other rendering modes apart from the client-side rendering. So you've said that, like, for example, the incremental static generation, you have you set a timer where the whatever, I don't know how I can call this, or rather if it's a client or it sends a request to get the new content from the server each after that time that you've given it. Now there's this case of being that it's file-based routing, so meaning that there is no like there's no entry file. So it's unless you build, and when I was building the Nuxt app, there's this file that was created, the it was somewhere inside the output folder, index.mjs, I think, where when I was trying to deploy it, the documentation that I found is I was using a reverse proxy, that is Nginx. So I was supposed to like point it to that file so that when the server is hit, that is the exact entry file that Nuxt would be looking for. So my question is, when I'm using server-side rendering or the other modes that are rendering, like the incremental static generation, when I build my app once, then that file is generated. Then I proxy to that file, so that's the entry file, and then I make changes to the app. Then I restart the server, assuming I'm using something like a process manager, like something like PM2. Then I restart the server. Will I need to run the Nuxt build again each time I make changes and restart the server? I don't know if that question was clear.
Okay. So what you're trying to say is that, let's say, for example, you have created your web application that uses incremental static regeneration, and then you have built it. But the question is, have you deployed it? Rizwan, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm there. I was having a problem unmuting. Yeah, actually the question is, I had deployed it on a I deployed it on a server. So the thing is, whatever I was using to deploy required me to like point the domain to exactly where the project is, the project folder that is. But again, you'll need to provide an entry file, like which is the entry file that it's going to start running your project. So when I was building the app with the Nuxt build command, it generated a file inside the output folder called index.mjs, I think, yeah. Then I was supposed to point to point the server block to that exact file. So the question is, when I make changes to the project itself, then I restart the server, will I need to build the app again so that that same file will be regenerated, or it will be just looking for it after every time?
So let me answer that by simply saying, okay, so let me just give you just an example, okay? So you have basically, if you get an index.mjs file, what it simply means that your application is either universally rendered or server-side rendered, and hence you're using the Node environment. And so what happens is that when you deploy this application, let's say you are getting your data from a remote source, let's say it's your database. What happens is that when you deploy this application, when you build it using the Nuxt build command, and then you deploy it to Vercel or Netlify, what happens is that, when there is new data that is present in your database, you actually don't need to do anything. What if you're using incremental static regeneration? What happens is that after the specified time period, a request will be sent to the server automatically, which will retrieve the new data. And in your case, you have used universal rendering or server-side rendering, whichever you have used. What happens is that if your site is deployed, the data, if there is any available data, it will be just be displayed automatically. Your site will be up to date with the latest data, and you don't need to do any changes unless you wanted to change something on your site yourself. If, let's say, you wanted to make a change, let's say you wanted to change the color of the navbar, what will happen is that you will need to come back again to your Visual Studio Code, make that change. You will need to build again, and then deploy it now with your new navbar style. If it's in terms of the data, and if it's getting it from the database and there is new data that has arrived, you actually don't need to build it again. But if it's any change that you have made in any of your files, let's say, or components, if you have changed something, you actually need to build it again and then send it.
Yeah, that's a bit clear now. One last question. Maybe it's not exactly a question, but just a concern. The edge side rendering thing ilinipita kiasi. So if you could at least recap that.
Okay, sure. So let me just recap everything really quickly. So basically, edge side rendering, a lot of people get confused because it has the word rendering at the end. They think it's a rendering mode, but it's not a rendering mode. Rather, it's an enhancement feature that was introduced in Nuxt 3, and it's actually a deployment target. And it can be used with other rendering modes, such as client-side rendering, server-side rendering, static site generation, incremental static regeneration, hybrid rendering. It can be used with all these rendering modes to enhance the performance of your Nuxt application. And how does it do this? So back then, before edge side rendering was introduced, what will happen is that if you wanted, let's say, to access the Tesla content, if you wanted to access the Tesla website, which is hosted in the USA, it's hosted in the servers in America, what happens is that you in Kenya, when you send a request, your request starts from Kenya, it goes all the way to America, gets the content, and then comes back to you. So back then, that was fine. We never had anything to compare it against in terms of speed. So we said, okay, this is fine. But now edge side rendering was introduced, whereby instead of your request having to travel from Kenya to the United States, what if that content can be brought closer to you? We have servers in Kenya. So what if that content can actually be pre-rendered through a CDN, and in edge side rendering, we use proxy servers. So the content is brought closer to you. So if the Tesla team, the developers, have utilized edge-side rendering, what will happen is that when you make a request now, your request actually won't have to go all the way to the United States. It will actually go to the server near you and get that content for you. And actually, it will be really, really quickly. It will be really, really fast. If now we compare the speed of these two requests, you'll actually come to see that when you utilize edge-side rendering, the request has a reduced latency. And basically what latency means is the measure or duration of time it takes a request to travel from point A to B and then back. So we have a reduced latency. The time taken is so minimal because now the content is closer to you.
Yeah, that's also a bit clear. So like, Solomon, can you get me?
Yes, I can still hear you.
So is it configured somewhere, or it's a default behavior of Nuxt 3?
Actually, you need to configure it. So let's say if you decide to use edge-side rendering, what you can simply do is you have options. You can either deploy it on Vercel or on Netlify, but you must configure some things. So you need to set the Nitro preset to your hosting platforms presets. Let's say, for example, if you are deploying it to Vercel, you set the Nitro preset to Vercel Edge. If you are deploying it to Netlify, you set the Nitro preset to Netlify Edge. So you actually need to do some configurations.
Oh, thanks.
You're welcome.
We have another question in the chat from Derek. Did you say, yeah, okay. I think you can check it out.
Okay, Derek, hi. Did you say still while revalidate is the same as incremental static regeneration? Well, actually the behavior is kind of the same, but these are two different concepts, but they behave just the same. You're welcome.
Nice. So thank you all for joining the meeting. Thank you, Salmon, for giving us this amazing presentation and taking us through this amazing topic. So to our community, I'd ask you to follow us on social media. On Twitter, we are at Kenya View. We'll actually be posting a link to a Discord channel for you to ask any questions that you may have, any technical questions that you may have. But also, if you're not on our WhatsApp group, kindly DM our Twitter account and we'll be sure to send you an invite. With that, thank you all. Have a great evening. Cheers all.